So last fall, we decided to experiment with the Ruth Stout method of permaculture gardening. After cutting the grass, we measured and marked the designated areas, laid out a bunch of old spoiled hay, and then just let it sit there all winter. In the spring, we pulled some of the hay aside to see that the grass and other undesirables were already beginning to decompose. The soil was moist and the earthworms were abundant. Compare that to the weed-laden ground directly adjacent to our experiment, and we quickly saw the value in this form of no-work gardening. We've previously described how and why this method works, so we won't duplicate the explanation here. But for those of you who are new to our channel, please see the links on the screen and in the description. Now last week, we planted a massive pile of seed potatoes by simply pushing the hay aside, dropping the spuds in, and then covering them up with an additional layer of hay. This will not only keep the potatoes covered from the sun, but also hopefully smother out any of the weeds which were determined enough to make it through the first layer. Now remember, we never dug, tilled, or amended this plot. We never removed the sod layer, and we didn't bury the potatoes in soil. We literally just covered the former lawn with hay. So time will tell if these potatoes grow as well as Ruth's did, but so far, we're pretty confident. However, that only filled one of our 2 Ruth Stout beds. So in this episode, we've decided to double down on the experiment by attempting to grow carrots, onions, and radishes. I say attempting because it's typically recommended to plant these particular vegetables in deep, loose, and well-worked soil. Or in other words, the exact opposite of this plot. Root vegetables need a lot of elbow room to grow large and symmetrical, so even the most ardent Ruth Stout believers would likely scoff at such an attempt in the first spring after laying out the hay. Sure, in future years, once the sheet mulching has had time to work its magic, but right away? We must be crazy. Well, if we weren't willing to go against the grain and try new things from time to time, then frankly, we'd likely not even be here having this conversation at all. So let's not worry about the naysayers and just have some fun. So the plan this time is to plant alternating rows of carrots and onions, because these 2 veggies are often grown together as a form of companion planting. You see, the carrot fly, which can wreak havoc on the growing roots, just happens to be easily confused by strong, pungent smells, like rosemary, sage, and onions. So alternating the rows should help to protect the carrots as they develop. It's a great way to control pests without actually injuring them, or polluting the environment with chemicals. As usual, trust nature. One of the other challenges that people often face when planting carrots has to do with the difficulty of properly spacing out such tiny seeds. And that's where the radishes come in. By planting them both in the same row, we first get to take advantage of the relatively quick growth of the radish, followed by the added benefit of the spaces left behind once we harvest them. This lets us produce twice as much food from the same space, gives an early crop followed by a later crop, and also prevents some of the annoying thinning that is usually necessary to ensure that the carrots grow large and healthy. We'll likely still have to thin them out to a certain extent, but every bit of saved energy helps. Alright, let's do this. Once again, we started out by pushing the hay aside to form narrow rows of exposed earth. Since we wanted to make sure that each row had the appropriate spacing, we first placed small stones at the edge of the bed every foot or so. I'm amazed at how often these leftover waste materials from building our hugelkultur mounds continue to come in handy. This was pretty easy work, so it only took a few minutes. Next, we began poking holes every few inches, just large enough for the onion bulbs, and placed them in with the pointy side up. A little pinch of the soil ensured that they were well contained, and then it was just a matter of repeating the process for every second row, until we reached the end. Finally, we scraped a shallow groove into the remaining rows and gently sprinkled in the carrot and radish seeds. We had previously mixed the 2 different types of seeds at about a 1-to-1 ratio, and we figured that random chance should provide an adequately even distribution. Once the seeds were in, we covered them lightly with about a 1/4 inch of soil and gently patted them smooth. Then we gave everything a bit of water, and that was it. One more garden bed complete. So now the question remains, will these plants be successful? And honestly, we don't really know. As I mentioned, this isn't exactly the typical conditions for planting these types of veggies. But we also don't really care if the carrots end up being misshapen or if the onions never reach their full size potential. As we've said previously, we're not trying to win any contests here. Our main hope is that while the roots begin to grow, they'll also help to quicken the process of breaking up the hard-packed topsoil in a natural way, leaving us with better conditions for next year. It helps to think of the long game sometimes, because we've got years to figure this out, so we might as well enjoy the ride. And besides, if we treat these little guys as a free labor force that also just happens to provide some sort of harvest throughout, well, that's good enough for us. And if not, then, well, it's still a fun experiment either way. And the results, whatever they might be, will give us all something to talk about. So as always, stay tuned, and we'll let you know. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. Remember those potatoes from last week? Well, I couldn't help myself. I had to take a peek. And check out all of the tiny white roots that have begun to sprout from the spuds. This may not seem like a big deal to some of you, but my goodness is it ever satisfying to see that something we put into motion is already starting to take hold. So, thanks so much for joining us on this adventure. We'll see you all again soon.